Okay, perfect. Well, I think it's a little bit past 8, so we'll go ahead and get started. I want to open the floor first, as Dr. Ottoson always does in his lectures, to you guys. If there's any questions that you specifically want me to address, or anything you guys would like to talk about, we'd love to start the discussion with that. So, feel free to chime in anytime if you guys have any questions you'd like to talk about. Okay, so Max asked, what is an example of a test question that we might have? I'm going to go through a lot of those. I'm not going to put it off. I mean, well, I guess I kind of am going to put that question off, which I'm sorry to say, if a lot of you guys can't stay the whole lecture, you're going to miss out on a Kahoot that I have at the end that's going to have a lot of examples of what the test will ask. Doc, I'll give you like a full disclosure of how the tests work for Dr. Ottoson. He has a huge bank of questions. So, the test questions that you'll see on your test is probably going to be a lot different than test questions that students will see on theirs. They'll be the same type of questions, but they'll be different. And the purpose of that, of course, is because we're doing all of our lectures online now. We don't want students to have any sort of ability to be able to just Google all their answers. So I will tell you, that the purpose of his questions are going to be to make sure that you guys can't do that. But let me give you just like one example of a kind of question that you'll see. Let's see here. Okay, so an example question will be something along the lines of, Aaron Pitkin asked the author to make him an alias or to not disclose of his real name. Why? What was his reasoning behind this? And he'll have multiple choice answers that you can go through. And of course, you'll have to determine which one is correct. So I'm just curious, does anybody know why in Strangers Drowning, Aaron decides or tells the author that he doesn't want his name disclosed?
Was it because he was eating meat sometimes with the executives?
Mm-hmm, exactly. And do you, if you don't mind me asking, do you remember why, like, he was super strong advocating for animals and not eating animals? Why did he justify reasons to eat animals with meat executives, if you remember?
He wanted to sit down with them and chat and seem like a normal person and maybe convince them that maybe they should treat animals better, but they might not take him seriously if he seemed like a wacko vegetarian.
Exactly. Yeah. And in conclusion, from everything you said, which was exactly right, we can all determine that it was for a utilitarian perspective. He wanted to maximize relieving animal suffering by eating a little bit of meat with meat executives so that they would be able to work with him and he can help them to alleviate a little bit more suffering. And so that's kind of his justifications for why he would choose to eat meat with the meat executives. So Dr. Ottoson might ask a question like that and might look for reasonings behind why Aaron would justify doing that. So I'd kind of be thinking in that terms for test questions. And then May, you asked, is the test all multiple choice or are there essay questions? I don't think there's going to be any essay questions. As far as I'm aware, that's how it was last semester. It could change, but I really don't think that's going to be the case. There might be some true or false, but it's usually going to be multiple choice or true or false. I'm about 99% sure on that though. So I'll confirm with Dr. Ottoson next class period and we can kind of make sure he goes over that a little more time. Okay, awesome. Yeah, and again, if you guys have questions, feel free to just jump in. Even if I'm talking, I'm happy for the discussion to go anyway here. At the end of the video, again, we'll do a Kahoot. I have 20 questions on there. The 20 questions are going to be actually similar to questions that are on the test. I do know some of the questions. I haven't had any of the questions word for word because I don't think that that's something that Dr. Artisan would want from these SLI sessions. But they definitely are questions that can help you think about the kind of material that you should know for the test. So without further ado, we'll get into it. Basically, I've created a PowerPoint that's going to briefly gloss over the things we've discussed in the last 4 weeks. There's a lot of information that we've discussed, a lot of things that you guys have read. And so I'm really going to be skimming the surface. If you have specific questions about characters, let's talk about them. But I'll kind of highlight some of the main points that we have. So very famously, the opening discussion of our unit was the trolley scenario. The trolley scenario, of course, was we had a man here at a switch. There was a trolley, and it was going down tracks where it was about to be divided. On one side of the tracks, there was 5 people tied to the tracks. On the other side, there was 1. Essentially, someone is going to die in this situation. And it was the kind of thinking and the scenario puts you in a position where you have to choose if you're going to save the lives of 5 people or if you're going to save the life of 1 person. I think that this is fairly used in a lot of ethical courses because of the way it makes you think about so many different things. First, I think our inclination is to say, well, it's better to save 5 than it is to save the 1, so we might as well flip the switch and kill the 1 and save the 5. And that's a utilitarian standpoint. But and a lot of people, in our discussion, there was a lot of different reasons behind why that might be wrong, why other scenarios might be better. Some had said that it's better to not do anything. And there's a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of different inclinations that we all have that we're inclined to do, or that we would be inclined to want to do because we think it's right. Does anyone have questions about the trolley scenario? Okay. So I think it's a good introduction to all of our moral theories, and that's why we start with it. We've talked about 4 major moral theories so far. Consequentialism was one of the first ones. Consequentialism essentially says that the good of an action is based on the consequence, or in other words, that the ends are what justify the means. So as long as your action produces good consequences, then your actions were just. Utilitarianism states that acting in accordance with whatever creates the most utility. So it's very similar to consequentialism in that we're trying to produce the most good through our actions in seeking the best consequences. But utility is a little bit more specific. So maximizing utility would be reducing the most amount of suffering and promoting the greatest amount of happiness through our actions. So I think consequentialism and utilitarianism are definitely the easier ones to understand. It kind of gets a little bit more murky when we get into deontology and especially into virtue ethics. So deontology, I think, very briefly explained, is that things are good in and only of themselves, and it follows a categorical imperative. So deontology is more concerned with universal laws and principles that we follow that would be right basically for everybody. They're not used as a means to an end, or I guess, so they're good in and only of themselves. So they're not good because of the consequences that they produce. It's pretty much the complete opposite of what consequentialism is. For deontology to work, it has to fall underneath the 2 formulas: formula of humanity and the formula of the universal law. So the formula of humanity states that you cannot use people as a means to an end. You can use anyone as a mere object or tool for some other purpose. And then the formula of the universal law says that only act on maxims that all rational agents could act on without leading to incoherence or absurdity. So most famously, we use the example of lying, that it's always wrong under any circumstances. And I think that gets us thinking about how to understand deontology. So according to what the formula of humanity state and the formula of the universal law, why would lying always be wrong? How can you use those 2 formulas to justify what a deontologist would say? if anyone wants to answer that.
I think basically if everyone lied, what kind of world would we live in? Kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on track. Like, what say more about like the world would be. It's, I mean, another word is like the world would be in absurdity, and I think it's kind of hard to grasp and to understand like what exactly is being said there. So if everybody were to lie, then there would be no truth. If there's no truth, then there really is no lying. So it kind of contradicts himself. So it becomes absurdity in that way. So yeah, Max, I think you're exactly right. But what about the formula of humanity? So saying that you cannot use people as a means to an end. Why would lying? How would lying be using somebody as a means to an end?
I don't know if I'm right on this, but it'd be like cheating someone else, or not telling them the truth is kind of using them, because by not telling them the truth, you're getting something out of it and you're using them. Is that right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the most famous example is during World War II, when people had housed Jews to protect them if a German soldier was to come and say, "Are you housing Jews? Where you live?" And you lied to them. Kant would say that's wrong because you're using the guards, the people who are questioning you, as a mere means to an end. You're only trying to satisfy your own desires at that point. So, Max, I think you actually said it a lot better than I did. So, I think you're exactly right. Okay, does anyone have questions about deontology? Okay, let's move on here. Okay, so next is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, honestly, in my opinion, is a little bit more murky. And that's because it really is a little bit vague in its terms. So virtue ethics is actions that are done out of a desire of being virtuous. So of course, it begs the question, well, what is virtue? What does it mean to be virtuous? Virtue is a disposition or a character trait that leads you to make good decisions. So something that is virtuous would be the mean between two extremes. Courage is virtuous. So we gave the example of, I think Dr. Augustine drew out, on one side of the spectrum, there was cowardice. On the other side, there was recklessness. Both of them are not virtuous. Both of them are they lead to kind of destruction, and bad things can happen from both. So you don't want to be overly courageous, which would be reckless, and you don't want to be under courageous, which would be cowardice. So it's finding the mean between both, which is courageous. And of course, it's in principle that makes a lot of sense, but like, how do you get to that point? And that's really the difficulty of virtue ethics is it's hard to define that. So we talked about in class, like what makes a good character, because that's what virtue ethics is essentially concerned with. Doing things that are virtuous, being virtuous is concerned with being the good character. So I don't know. You guys can read what I wrote here, but what do you guys think, based off our discussion, maybe in your own opinions, what makes a good character? What would make someone a virtuous person?
That's where I kind of have a hard time, because with everything we've gone over in this class and like ethical situations, deontology has like very firm lines, right? But virtue ethics, really, it's whatever you consider to be moral, right? And so it's very, like you said, it's like really murky. Like, it's basically like a self-fulfilling kind of thing. If you feel virtuous, in my opinion, if you feel like what you're doing is virtuous, then that's good enough.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where we all are inclined to think about with virtue ethics, um, because we all have different ideas of what a good life is or of what a good person is. And I don't know, we wouldn't brush on it in social ethics. If you're to take like virtue ethics or in like the actual ethics course at USU, you might read the Nicomachean Ethics. Um, and Aristotle, when he had written it, he talked a lot about inclinations. Essentially, he believed that all humans have a natural desire or a natural drive to do good things. And so the good things that we all are inclined to do, that's what's virtuous. That's what's good. And I mean, there's arguments against that, but I think that's a little bit more of what Aristotle was getting into with virtue ethics. So inclinations is kind of like our natural tendencies, our natural desires. And so if we truly do good things, and just like you said, Max, like it's based off of what you think is, you're leaning towards that's good. So it's, I don't know, it's murky because obviously people are not doing, someone might do something that they think is good that we perceive as not good. The case of cannibalism that we use all the time in our class is something that a civilization might not deem as necessarily bad, but we in our civilization probably would not deem that as good. And I'm sure you guys can think of a lot of other examples than the one I just shared, but I think another thing that it's important to understand about virtue ethics, because we are going to start discussing more characters that embody virtue ethics. We read someone today, Dorothy, who was probably the first person that we talked about who embodies virtue ethics. It's important to understand that virtue ethics is a skill that someone is working towards. And it's somebody, essentially when you are considered to be a virtuous person, your actions are going to be considered morally correct naturally. So if you have virtue, your actions will always be good. So again, it's a little bit confusing. Does anyone have questions about that though? So I think a question that I had though, and perhaps a little bit more of a discussion from class today, for those who are part of the 12 o'clock class, is we did discuss that Dorothy was probably more embodying virtue ethics than she was utilitarianism. And that was a little bit more towards the end of her life when she decided she wanted to be a nurse in Nicaragua. She ultimately decided that that was the best thing to do because that is what she thought was going to make her happy. She wanted to help people and she wanted to do what she wanted to do. And so I'm curious if any of you guys have comments about it. If not, it's fine. Why do you think that we consider Dorothy to be someone who embodies virtue ethics rather than utilitarianism?
She wasn't trying to do the absolute most good towards the end. She was just trying to do some good or the most good she could do kind of thing. So she wasn't trying to change the whole world. She was changing individuals in Nicaragua as a nurse. Yeah,
I agree. And I think too, her experience at the end when she kind of laments about the people of Nicaragua who decide that they're going to spend their life watching soap operas when they get electricity. I think that also tells a lot about her desire to follow virtue ethics. Is she wanted these people not only to, she didn't only want to help these people as a nurse, but she wanted to help these people live good lives themselves. She wanted them to become virtuous. She didn't want them to embody this idea that they needed to be wealthy to be happy. That's essentially what she thought when they were watching soap operas, is they were watching it so that they can see the lives of these rich American people, because that's what they wanted to be. So she was sad about that. She thought that was not, they were completely missing the point for what a good life would be. She sacrificed all of that stuff to go do what she thought would make her happy. And I think that's an example of a virtue ethicist. She herself was doing what she thought was good and what she thought would be promoting good for other people. So I think a test question that you might see about virtue ethics, because it can be a little bit complicated, is what is virtue ethics concerned with? It's concerned with the character of the person. Deontology is concerned with the actions, the action itself. Is it good in and of itself? Is it using someone as a mere means to an end? And then consequentialism and utilitarianism is concerned with the results of your actions. So Dr. Ottoson kind of drew that little diagram where you have the character, you have an arrow pointing towards the consequences. Virtue ethics is pointing towards the character because that's what it's concerned with. Deontology is concerned with the arrow, the actions itself. And then consequentialism and utilitarianism is concerned with the results of those actions. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just briefly brush over the characters we've talked about. We've talked about 4 significant characters so far, starting with Peter Singer, one of the most influential utilitarians in the 20th century. His argument goes as follows. He says, if you can prevent evil and suffering without sacrificing something of comparable moral worth, then you should. There are currently a great deal of suffering or evil that affluent people and nations could prevent without sacrificing anything of comparable moral worth. So you should donate your excess income or resources to the point where you almost sacrifice something of comparable worth. So he's basically saying it is our moral duty that if we have the means to give to other people, we should give those, give to other people. He gives the hypothetical of a child drowning. If we were to walk by and see a child drowning and we have every means to save that child, it's our moral duty to save that child. And he compares that to world suffering as well. So, if we know that people are dying of malaria in Africa and we have the means to provide the malaria nets, then we're more morally responsible to provide those for them. Again, that's pretty glossing over what he said. He gets into a lot more specifics about, battling world suffering and humanitarian work. But I think it's important to understand this argument specifically in this hypothetical because this is what inspired a lot of the other readers that we're going to discuss in Strangers Drowning, such as Aaron and Julia and other effective altruists who, wanted to alleviate suffering. So he also talks about animal rights. Before I get into that, though, does anyone have questions about Peter Singer's stance on humanitarian work or his desire to help other people? And we had a lot of great discussions and questions in class about some of his extremes, I think, because someone to consider his ideals a little bit unrealistic. So if anyone has questions about that, please feel free. If not, we'll talk about animal rights. Okay, so Peter Singer, of course, another, being a utilitarian, he wanted to extend those moral responsibilities that we have for humans to animals. Moral consideration should be given to all things that have sentience. So sentience, I don't know if we talked too much about it in class, but sentience essentially is the ability to feel pleasure or pain. So anything that can feel pain, Peter Singer wants us to consider with our moral decisions. He gives the example, so I think this main claim here, the claims that a baby has less rationality than most mammals. I think this is where we kind of get into the intensity of his argument, because essentially, I don't know. So here it says, claims that a baby has less rationalities than most male mammals. How does this claim support his argument? So his argument for why, essentially, if you think that we shouldn't eat animals because they don't have rationality, because they can't think, then he says, then why don't you eat babies? Because babies can't think and don't have as much rationality as male mammals do. So, and then towards the end, he says, Singer thinks that the only reason people justify eating meat is because it tastes good. And he claims we don't need it in our diet. So I highlighted these 3 main points. I know there's so much more we could talk about with animal rights with Peter Singer, but I think these ones are important to understand for test questions. Dr. Otterson might ask the question like, why would someone give, why would Peter Singer, how would Peter Singer counter argue an argument that we would need to eat meat for our diets? And he would say, well, it's because Peter Singer thinks that we only need to eat meat, or we only eat meat because it tastes good. There's no evidence that we need it in our diets. In fact, we'll be healthier if we don't eat meat in our diets. Those type of things that is what I would consider for the test. Okay, jumping to Aaron Pitkin real quick. Similar to Peter Singer, he was a hard utilitarian, and he extended that view towards animals, thinking that we all, needed to reduce pain and suffering within animals as well as human life. He's a pretty hard utilitarian. We give the example of when he's walking to his test, and it's raining outside, and he sees all the worms coming up out of the earth, and he thinks it's his moral responsibility to save those worms from people who would step on them. And it makes him late for his test, and he misses the question because he was late and he didn't have enough time. But that's kind of an introduction to the extremes that Aaron goes to, because his life is very extreme. He's more concerned with suffering than he is with maximizing pleasure and happiness, which is kind of interesting for a utilitarian, because utilitarians are, just as concerned, or if not more concerned, about promoting pleasure and happiness for individuals, and not just reducing suffering. So we already talked about why he eats meat on certain occasions, but I think it's interesting that he chooses to care for chickens. Not because chickens suffer more than other animals, or because there's more problems with chickens in the world. He does it because he thinks that chickens are the animals that are least advocated for. They're the most helpless and most trodden on animals. So again, if he's concerned with reducing the most suffering he possibly can, then he's going to think about the area or areas where not much work is being done. In this case, it was chickens. So that's why he decides to advocate for chickens. And then we jump to Julia Kaufman. Julia is a little bit different in that she is following Peter Singer's his moral theory of utilitarianism, but more for humanitarian aid for humans rather than for animals. Julia Kaufman was the one who bought a candy apple, and it completely drove her over the edge. Why? It's because she realized the $4 or $5, however much it was that she used to buy the apple, could have saved, I think it was 4 people in Africa. If you could buy 2 malaria nets with $4 and 1 malaria net saves 2 people. She could have saved 4 people with the $4 she bought with the candy apple. So that's the kind of thinking that Julia had, is she wanted to use and be as most efficient with her money as she possibly could in providing aid worldwide. So one of the first limits that they set for themselves is $38 a week to spend on themselves. They do this because they think they can live off this. There was a point where Julia was donating 100% of all of her money that she made, and her husband, Jeff, was donating 50% of all that he made. They believe they have an ultimate obligation to help as many people as possible, even though they know they can't save everyone. And so I think this was kind of a common question within the class, is why would they make the effort to go and sacrifice so much in their life if they knew they couldn't save everybody? And she addresses this pretty clearly. She says it's because if everybody was donating and doing as much as I would, then I wouldn't have to do so much. And so regardless of the fact that she knows she can't save everybody, she thinks it's her moral responsibility, and all of our moral responsibilities, to do as much as we possibly can. Some major points at the bottom I gave is she emphasizes sustainability rather than giving more. So she wants to promote, like charities that provide sustainability rather than just giving. So instead of giving someone water, she would be more interested in providing wells, something that would sustain populations instead of just giving them the needs that they need immediately. And again, she's about efficiency. So we gave an example of the kidney transplant that cost $1.4 million or however much it was. You know, some of us would consider that pretty morally praiseworthy for somebody to sacrifice their kidney and to save someone's life. But she said that $1.4 million used to save one person's life could have saved thousands and thousands of other lives. You know, people in Africa who are suffering from malaria, for example. And then I highlight this last point, which is effective altruism. This kind of goes back to Peter Singer. And in fact, he is a lot more of an advocate for effective altruism. But effective altruism is a movement that was made to find charities that can save the most lives for the least amount of money. And so Dr. Ottoson gave you the example of the GiveWell website, which links to organizations that people think is the most effective in that way. Okay, and then we get to Dorothy Granada. She's the last person we've read. We talked about her today. Dorothy she's pretty interesting and a little bit different from the others. She is at first a utilitarian. She believes she had a revelation from God where she needed to stand with the poor and prevent as much violence as possible. So this is where she becomes concerned with nuclear warfare, the nuclear race that's going on at the time with the Soviets. And she went on a 38-day hunger strike to protest it. She was inspired by Gandhi, who fasted many times to be, as a form of protest. Her hunger strike really wasn't effective. Does anyone remember from our discussion why she stopped her fast? This is important to know. I think this is probably a test question that you guys will get.
Did it have anything to do with her friend calling her? I don't remember exactly, but her friend called her and told her that it was over.
Yeah, exactly. She had I think he was a Catholic priest. He called her and said, basically, enough's enough, stop. And so she did at 38 days, and then her husband stopped the day later. It's interesting because her son had begged her and pleaded with her to stop, to not even do the fast in the first place because of the toll it would take on her. She was to the point where she was blind because she didn't eat for so long. And, I think arguments can be made that she was to the point where she just, she couldn't take it anymore. And so she listened to the reason of her friend. But regardless, it's interesting. So yeah, consider that. I think that might be a question on the test. Something like, why did Dorothy decide to end her fast? What was her reasoning behind that? And this was a pretty pivotal moment for her life. After this, she said basically to her husband, I'm going to do what I want to do now. I'm going to take charge for my moral efforts. And so Dorothy decides to become a nurse and to go to Nicaragua. In spite of the civil war that's going on over there, she wanted to stand with the poor. She was sick of living an affluent lifestyle where she saw privileged people, and she wanted to be with her own kin. And so that's kind of what led her to that point. Okay, so that's pretty much what I prepared. I know I spoke really fast and went through a lot of it, but there was a lot of material that we covered in the last 4 weeks. I have a Kahoot with like 20 questions on it. I think it'd be definitely worthwhile for us to play. But before we get into that, does anyone have questions about the material we've covered? Anything I went over? Any questions about what I said that we can address?
My audio cut out a little bit when you were explaining why she stopped the fast. It was because a priest told her to stop. Is that what you said?
It was either a Catholic priest or a minister. It was some religious person, but ultimately it was her friend. And yeah, he basically said enough's enough, and she stopped.
She didn't listen to her son?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
And I don't remember, did her husband end up leaving her in Nicaragua?
I don't think so. I know she was married twice, which is kind of confusing, but her second husband was the one who pretty much did all the humanitarian efforts with her. So I don't think she actually did leave her in Nicaragua. I could be wrong though. So yeah, I actually don't have a copy of Strangers Journeying to look that up. So maybe that's a question that I will double check with Dr. Ottoson and have him kind of go over again. we went over Dorothy super fast in class discussion. There's so many things we didn't go over. Like towards the end of the class, we started discussing the Civil War that was happening between the Contras and the Sandinistas. So I would imagine he's probably going to go over a little bit more of it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if her husband left her in Nicaragua or not. Okay, let me get this figured out. So, okay, so I exited the link there, but if you guys have smartphones or if you're on your computers, just go to your web browser and go to kahoot.it. And let's see. Okay, there's the game pin. Once you guys are on there, I'll get started. Okay, sweet. Let's start it up here. All right, a deontologist would give the following reason for why lying is always wrong. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so both of those are right reasons for why a deontologist would say that lying is wrong. Again, it's involved with the universal or the formula of humanity, which would say that you can't use someone as a mere means to an end. And then the formula of the universal law essentially is if everyone can act in accordance with that, what it calls absurdity, if everyone can do it, then it passes that formula. Does anyone have questions about that? All right, next question. Okay, what is categorical imperative? All right. Okay, so this is a tough one. I know I didn't even go over it. A categorical imperative, it's a universal law. It's a principle that everyone would be able to act by. It's usually in the form of like a thou shalt. So, the 10 commandments are, could be considered categorical imperatives. Everybody, regardless of any circumstances, is morally obligated to follow those laws. So that's kind of where the line comes in. It's a universal law that everyone can follow at any time, and it's always morally permissible or impermissible not to follow that law. Okay, deontology is concerned with the action, whether it is good in and of itself. What is virtue ethics concerned with? Okay, so the moral duty of the person, I can see why someone would choose that. But virtue ethics is concerned with the character itself. It's not, moral duty is more concerned with the in-day ontology. That kind of falls underneath the categorical and comparative that we just discussed there. So I think that is the most important point you can know about virtue ethics is if it is concerned with the character of the person, whether that person is a good person doing virtuous acts or becoming a more better person from it, then it probably is going to fall underneath the virtue ethics. Nice, cool. Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly right. I thought someone might have picked red, and I think there's truth to red as well when it maximizes utility, being a utilitarian. But if you're only waiting to know, like, okay, well, I know I can promote a lot of happiness if I do it, then I think you're going to miss some opportunities that Peter Singer would say are opportunities to help people. So it's always, if you have the means to help others, then you're obligated to give and to do. To help other people in that way. Cool. Yeah, so this, I chose both. This comes right from the text. She quotes this. She says that if everyone would pull their weight, I wouldn't need to do as much. But I think it's also true that she would say, if I can't save everybody, she acknowledges that, but she knows that she's morally obligated to save and to help as many people as she can. Right, pretty close. Awesome. Okay. I'm glad you guys got that right because I know we didn't really go over that, but that comes right from the text. I'll be honest, I think this is a question that you could see on your test. And so, again, everyone's test will be a little bit different, but she was distraught. Yeah, she watched a documentary where she saw kind of the slave labor or the inhumane conditions that these workers were working in. And it just sent her over the edge when she got a DVD player because she knew how people were treated when they made him. Perfect. Does anyone want to explain why? I thought this would be a harder question to answer, but you guys did awesome.
She could earn more if she just stayed in the US and worked. Exactly.
Yep. Yeah, that's essentially the effective altruist mindset. It's not about, being a nurse in Nicaragua is great, but you could do so much more if you made more money and donated that money to people with malaria. So yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, I'll be honest, that was a pretty awkward question. Kind of just worded a little bit weird. But this is something that Dr. Ottosen's quoted specifically, is that she thinks giving is a duty. It's not about making yourself happy, making yourself feel good. It's just what I am morally responsible to do. Awesome, good job. I don't know if it's going to be next class. I'd have to look at the syllabus, but we're going to talk about foreign intervention in this class and the ethics behind that. And this is a pretty, a pretty critical moment for, I don't know, for a discussion like that. Was it just for us to send and support these mercenaries in Nicaragua? Ronald Reagan wanted to basically diminish the entire Communist Party, and especially any sort of rising Communist Party that was to come. So he was full on board to send people in to help in that civil war. But that is, also in the context of Dorothy, who was in Nicaragua at the time. She was opposed to the Contras movement because of basically all the destruction that it caused. Perfect. Yeah, I said pastor friend here. I said Catholic priest, the other one. It was her friend. It was a religious leader. I honestly don't know if it was a pastor or a priest, but it was a religious leader who was her friend. Okay, perfect. You would probably see a question like this on the test as well, but Kahoot kind of makes it so I can't type as much, and it's kind of hard to answer a question that's really long in 30 seconds. But you'd probably see a question like this, and the answers will give justifications for the moral theory. So Aaron Pitkin most closely aligns to utilitarianism because he wants to reduce the most possible suffering in the world. And it's important to read those because some of them are just not even correct with the moral theory. So understand what the moral theory is. Definitely review those before the test because you'll probably be some trick questions like that. All right, we're still pretty close. Yep, perfect. All right, perfect. Yeah, again, sorry about the horrible grammar on that answer. But effective altruism, just, if you can make more money and donate more money, then that's going to be the most effective thing to do. It's for any business majors, if any of you are business majors, it's kind of similar to opportunity cost. If you can make more money doing one thing and that can get you more outcome, then that's going to be better to do. I also said that Doctors Without Borders is not as cost effective as buying malaria nets. So that's also true. It is a good organization that, they do great things, but they're concerned with saving the most lives as possible. Perfect. Yep. So again, I think this comes back to a little bit of the virtue ethics. that she embodies. She sees that these people are designed to be rich, which isn't involved in the good life at all. So that's kind of why she was pretty upset about that. All right, looks like Ella is taking the lead. Okay, perfect. Yeah, when I talked about Singer, I was a little bit all over the place, but this is essentially the argument I was trying to get out with Singer. It involved with animal testing. If we can test on animals that because they don't have the ability to reason, then we should also be able to test on infants because they can't reason. They can reason just as much as a male mammal could. And so that's a kind of argument to that specific reasoning. If you think that you can test on animals just because they don't have as much reasoning capacity as other humans, then according to that same logic, you should be able to test on infants. And so this is a counter argument. He doesn't think that you can test on infants, but he's saying that this is essentially saying that if you believe this, then you would also believe in the absurdity of testing on infants. Okay, perfect. Yep. I think, another, and this was actually shared in the class for those of you who are in the 12 o'clock class. Well, someone said, well, babies have the potential of becoming rational beings eventually, whereas animals don't. And Singer actually addresses that specifically. He says, well, what about the severely handicapped? The ones who are to the point where they won't be able to reason in the future. Can we test on them? And of course, the answer is no. And that's another argument he gives as to why, if you can't test on animals because of their lack of moral reasoning, then you should also, yeah. So I think that says it a little bit better than I'm trying to explain it there. Okay, I think we got 3 questions left and it's super close. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I can see why that would be confusing just because of the last 2 questions. So remember, Singer is basically saying that we shouldn't test on animals just because they can't reason. He's not concerned with their ability to reason at all. He's concerned with their ability to feel pleasure and pain. And so, yeah, that was kind of my bad on the discussion before. But yeah, he's the basis of all of his moral reasoning is whether something can feel pleasure or pain, and that's why he extended towards animals, is because he thinks that they can feel pleasure or pain. He doesn't think that animals have a capacity for reason. He thinks they have just as much as infants because infants don't have any moral reasoning or capacity for reason. And so that's why it's not capacity for reason, because animals don't have it, but they can feel pleasure or pain. So they should be considered for moral reasoning. Yeah, because there was some confusion on that. Do any of you guys have questions about that? Let's see. Okay, if there's no questions, then we'll just move on. Got 2 more questions here. Perfect. I also think this would be a test question, because it speaks a lot to his moral reasoning. But it's kind of interesting for his moral reasoning too, I guess, because if he is such a hard utilitarian that he is, you'd think that he would pull the plug on his father, alleviate his suffering, and then he could save the money that he's using for the healthcare and use it towards his cause. But in this instance, which is kind of different from the rest of his life, he respects his father's wishes, and he thinks it's more morally salient to let his father do what he wishes to do with his own money than to take control of that. All right, last question. Okay, so I think they actually do have children. So I actually asked this question because I wanted to actually bring it up as a discussion. I couldn't find a text where it talked about this. Who answered it? Whoever answered yes, would you mind saying why you think yes, or why?
I think she mentioned that like she was torn about it because having children like reduces her power to help others, but she reasoned that she could raise her children to also be like her and to also help other people. So in the end, it would be a net positive.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't have the text to give a for sure on that, but I'm pretty sure you're on the right track. This was actually a test for the last semester, or a question for the last semester, for the same reasons that you gave. And I bring these questions up because it's kind of interesting. Her and Aaron, they're such, they're so active in their causes that they're willing to live these completely radical lifestyles, so that they can help as many people as they can. But both of them, as they get to the end of their life, kind of change their moral reasoning with these specific situations. So Julia, yeah, her and Jeff decided that they can have kids because she thinks that her children can provide more good for the world. So that is also part of her utilitarian standpoint. But Aaron's is a little bit different. He respects his father's wishes, but from a hard utilitarian that he was throughout his whole life, you think he would act a little bit differently. So it's just interesting. But I think you were right, Ella, that they do determine that it's okay to have a baby because eventually the baby could do good in the world. Okay, and that was it. Let's see. Okay, guys, awesome. 16 out of 20 is really good. I'll also make another disclosure about these tests is they are pretty rigorous. He asks pretty difficult questions. And again, the purpose of that is so that, people can't just Google the answers. It's going to require that you guys have done the readings, that you've at least attended lectures, and that you can, point out specifics of, reasonings behind these characters' actions. And I'm not saying that to make you guys worried about the test at all, because although the questions are pretty tough, Dr. Otterson's pretty lenient, and he wants to push you guys, but a low grade on the test is not going to give you a low grade in the class. So, but again, 16 out of 20 is super good. So it says a lot that you guys were here, that you guys participated, and I think that you guys are going to do really well in the course. That is going to wrap up everything that we'll talk about in SI. So if you guys have any questions, I'll stick around for a little bit. Yeah, that's all I had to share with you guys today.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you. I have a question. When is the exam? As well as if we go to the other SI session, is it going to be like the same thing?
So as far as the other SI, it'll be up to Jordan. Just know that the other class discusses the exact same material you do on the same times. So he'll cover the same material. He just might approach it a little bit differently. So I don't know if he'll do a Kahoot or if he'll have a PowerPoint or whatever he'll do. it's going to be up to him. But I'm assuming it would be pretty similar. And then as far as the test, let me hurry and pull it up real quick to see. Let me get out of share mode here. So the first exam is scheduled for March 5th, or excuse me, March 7th. So the end of week 7. I'm not sure how he will approach it this semester. He gave you kind of a gap, like a few day window to get it done. It is all online. I don't think you'll have to do it in the testing center, but just plan for May 7th on your own time, anytime that day, and you should be good.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
So what times are the SI sessions? Because I wasn't 100% sure, and I just like was checking my email and I saw that there was one. Just like